It all started on an ordinary Monday morning, or at least it should have been. My husband, Greg, left for work as usual. His suit impeccable. His goodbye kiss mechanical. We'd been married for 10 years, and while our life looked perfect from the outside, a nice house, decent careers, and a solid social circle, inside I was drowning. Greg was distant. His affection now reserved for his phone, his laptop, and the endless spreadsheets he called the real priorities. I spent most days managing the house, trying to distract myself with chores or yoga, but the emptiness never left. That was when James entered our lives. James was a 20-year-old college dropout who worked as a cleaner to make ends meet. Greg had hired him after a recommendation from a neighbor. From the moment I saw him, I couldn't help but notice his presence. Tall, with smooth ebony skin that seemed to glisten in the sunlight, James had a lean, muscular build. He was always polite, always professional, but his confidence radiated in every step he took. At first, I dismissed my curiosity about him. He was just the help after all. But one day something happened that changed everything. I was walking past the guest bathroom, a laundry basket balanced on my hip, when the door swung open. Steam billowed out, and there he was. James, fresh out of the shower, a towel slung low around his waist. Water trickled down his chest, tracing the lines of his toned abdomen before disappearing into the towel. His skin gleamed, every inch of him clean and radiant. My breath caught. For a moment I couldn't look away. He noticed me standing there, his eyes wide with surprise. "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quickly, retreating back into the bathroom. I stumbled down the hall, my heart racing. That image of him lingered in my mind long after he disappeared. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Over the next few days, I found myself stealing glances at James while he worked, watching the way his muscles moved when he scrubbed the floors or carried the trash bags. He was meticulous in his tasks, and something about his focus drew me in. I knew it was wrong. I was married, and James was young enough to be my son. But the more I tried to push the thoughts away, the more they consumed me. One afternoon, Greg came home early and barely acknowledged me. "Got a meeting," he muttered, heading straight to his office. I stood there, feeling invisible. It was moments like these that made me question everything about my life. That night, lying in bed beside Greg, who was already snoring, I made a decision. I didn't know where it would lead, but I couldn't ignore the fire James had ignited within me. The next morning, I lingered in the kitchen while James cleaned. "You're doing a great job," I said, my voice softer than usual. He looked up and smiled, a genuine smile that made my stomach flip. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied. "Call me Susan," I said, meeting his eyes. That was the moment the line began to blur. Want to hear how this unfolds? Hit that like button and subscribe for more real, raw, and dramatic stories that'll keep you hooked. After that morning in the kitchen, everything changed. James started calling me Susan, his voice lingering on my name in a way that sent shivers down my spine. I began finding excuses to spend more time near him, whether it was offering him lemonade on a hot afternoon or helping him carry supplies from his car. Greg's absence made it easier. My husband had become a ghost in our marriage, spending longer hours at work and barely speaking to me when he was home. James, on the other hand, was attentive, respectful, and vibrant in ways Greg hadn't been in years. It wasn't long before our conversations moved from polite exchanges to something deeper. One evening, I found James wiping down the windows in the living room. I sat on the couch, pretending to read a book. "You don't seem like someone who enjoys cleaning," I said, testing the waters. He chuckled, his deep voice rumbling in the quiet room. "It's not my dream job, but it pays the bills. Besides, I like keeping things neat." I nodded, watching the way his hands moved with precision. "You're good at it." "Thanks, Susan," he said, his eyes locking with mine for a moment longer than they should have. That moment hung in the air between us, and for the first time, I felt something unspoken pass between us. The night it finally happened was one I'll never forget. Greg had left for an overnight business trip, and I was alone in the house with James. He was finishing up his chores when a sudden thunderstorm knocked out the power. "Let me check the breaker box," James offered, grabbing a flashlight. "Thank you," I said, my voice unsteady. He returned a few minutes later, rain-soaked, shaking his head. "Looks like the power's out in the whole neighborhood." I handed him a towel. "You're drenched. Let me get you something to wear while your clothes dry." He hesitated but nodded. I brought him a t-shirt and sweatpants from Greg's closet. When he came back downstairs, wearing clothes that didn't quite fit his broad frame, my heart skipped a beat. "You look good," I blurted out before I could stop myself. James raised an eyebrow, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Thanks, Susan." I don't know what came over me, but in that moment I stepped closer. The tension between us was palpable. "You've been so kind," I whispered. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he said, his voice low and careful. "But I wanted to." I leaned in, and before I knew it, our lips met. The kiss was electric, filled with the kind of passion I hadn't felt in years. For a split second I thought about pulling away, but the pull was too strong. That night, we crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered secrets. James would find excuses to linger after his work was done, and I found myself living for the thrill of his touch, the warmth of his presence. Still, guilt gnawed at me. I wasn't blind to the risk I was taking. If Greg found out, it would destroy everything. But every time I tried to distance myself from James, the longing only grew stronger. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, I asked, "Do you think this is wrong?" He looked at me, his dark eyes filled with both desire and hesitation. "Yes," he said softly, "but I can't stop." Neither could I. That's when everything came crashing down. Greg came home early one night. James and I were in the laundry room, the door slightly ajar. I had just reached up to touch his face when Greg's voice boomed from the hallway, "Susan." We froze, my heart pounding in my chest as footsteps grew louder. I barely had time to step away from James before Greg pushed the door open, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his gaze darting between us. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. James looked at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. Greg didn't need an explanation. The truth was written all over my face. The moment Greg's eyes locked onto mine, I knew the truth had been exposed. His face twisted with disbelief. His usual calm shattered into jagged anger. "What the hell is this?" Greg's voice thundered, reverberating through the small laundry room. I froze, panic overtaking me. James took a step back, his head lowered, his hands trembling at his sides. "Greg, it's not," I started, but the words died in my throat. "Don't lie to me," Greg snapped, cutting me off. He turned to James, his expression darkening. "Get out. Get out of my house right now." James hesitated, his eyes meeting mine for a fleeting moment. I nodded, silently begging him to leave before things escalated further. Without a word, James slipped past Greg and disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone to face the storm. "What were you thinking, Susan?" Greg demanded once we were alone. His voice quieter now, but the hurt behind it unmistakable. I looked down, unable to meet his gaze. I don't know," I whispered. "Don't give me that," he spat. "How long has this been going on?" "A few weeks," I admitted, my voice barely audible. Greg let out a bitter laugh, running his hand through his hair. "A few weeks. My wife has been sneaking around with a 20-year-old cleaner? Do you even understand what you've done?" I tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumble. "Greg, you've been so distant. I've been lonely and what?" "That's your excuse," he interrupted. "You destroy our marriage because you're lonely. You think I don't feel the same way." His words hit me like a slap. I hadn't considered that Greg might be suffering too, that his silence might have been his own way of coping with the cracks in our relationship. The argument raged on for hours. Greg demanded every detail, each answer dragging the wound wider. I confessed to everything, The longing, the stolen moments, the undeniable pull I felt toward James. "I don't even know who you are anymore," Greg said finally, his voice hoarse from shouting. I had no defense. I wasn't the woman he thought I was. I wasn't even the woman I thought I was. The days that followed were a blur. Greg barely spoke to me, his anger simmering beneath a cold exterior. The house felt emptier than ever without James, but I couldn't bring myself to contact him. One night I found Greg in the living room, staring at our wedding photo. "Do you even regret it?" he asked without looking at me. Tears streamed down my face as I nodded. "Do. I'm so sorry, Greg. I never wanted to hurt you." He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Sorry doesn't fix this. I don't know if anything can." Greg started sleeping in the guest room, and we only spoke when necessary. The tension was suffocating, but I knew I had to let him process his feelings. I wanted to believe we could repair the damage, but deep down I wasn't sure. The silence between Greg and me grew heavier with each passing day. The man who used to share every thought with me now couldn't even look me in the eye. I tried to make things right, cooking his favorite meals, leaving notes apologizing, even offering to go to counseling, but nothing seemed to reach him. The house felt colder, emptier. The absence of James, the memories of what we'd done, and the undeniable rift between Greg and me were a constant weight on my shoulders. I wanted to turn back time to undo what I'd done, but the damage was already done. One evening, Greg called me into the living room. He was sitting on the couch, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses on the coffee table. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat. I sat across from him, my hands trembling. "I've thought about this a lot," he began. "About us. About what you did. And I've come to a decision." My heart sank. I could feel the finality in his tone. "I'm filing for divorce, Susan," he said, his words hitting me like a punch to the gut. "Greg, please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "We can work through this. I made a mistake, but I love you. I don't want to lose you." He shook his head, his expression pained but resolute. "I can't do it, Susan. Every time I look at you, I see him. I see what you did. You broke my trust, and I don't know if I can ever get it back." The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and difficult conversations. Greg moved out, leaving the house that had once been our home feeling like an empty shell. I reached out to James once, desperate for some kind of comfort, but he didn't respond. Deep down, I knew it was for the best. He deserved to move on, to live a life unburdened by the mistakes I'd made. Months later, I stood in what used to be our living room, packing the last of my belongings. The divorce was finalized, the house sold, and Greg and I had gone our separate ways. I thought about the life we'd built together, the love we'd once shared, and the choices that had led us here. It was a painful lesson, but one I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Some scars never fully heal, but they serve as a reminder of the mistakes we must never make again. As I closed the door behind me for the last time, I took a deep breath. This wasn't the ending I'd wanted, but it was the one I'd earned.